I will be giving a very informal talk about the things I've been doing for the past 4 years. The talk will be the same content, the same title at least, as the one I gave when I just joined MSP. So I will hopefully tell you what I have done and in a different light. So first of all, yeah, it's been 4 years, and I think it's a really interesting project. I really had the time to delve deep into something and something that I think it's really important. And so what I'm talking about here is deep learning, right? And so first to give a rough introduction, like what is deep learning and why am I interested in this? And so I think of it as a paradigm of writing the implementation of a program, not by hand, but giving some examples of input and output data. And starting with a rough guess, and then iteratively improving this until our implementation matches on its output, the output we've given it. And it's a quite powerful thing. It works for all sorts of data you can encode as numbers, right? So it works for text, audio, social networks. People have done this thing with like simplicial complexes and all sorts of stuff. But it's also problematic because it gives us an approximation, and most often we have no idea why it works. And it has exploded in recent times. So it's gone from like nerds tinkering with something that recognizes a cat to now full-fledged chatbots deployed in mission-critical systems. And the issues became of, oh, how can we convince people this is useful and good, to wait, we need to maybe think about what's happening. So I spent a few years thinking about what's happening. So yeah, I'll give a very rough, informal talk. It's not technical, but I'm gonna spend some time motivating this. Right, so did I say everything I wanted to say? I have a bunch of notes because otherwise I'm gonna forget. Right, so I find it very exciting. So what is deep learning? I think most people know here the story, but I'm gonna go over like some rough introduction just to get us all on the same ground. And I imagine some people just aren't familiar with it, so it's good to really go through this. So it is a subset of machine learning, which is loosely inspired by our neural networks in the human brain. And it deals with constructing this artificial interconnected networks of neurons that somehow behave in the way and learn, hopefully, analogous to the ways humans and animals learn. And it originated like 50 years ago. People first formulated something that they conjectured, and details have been changing a lot about how you do it, what you learn, and now it's a big field, and now there's so many things. But there's main three components in sort of all of these three, in all of the deep learning systems. So there's the artificial neural network, like our learning thing. We have a loss function, which is something that tells us in the paradigm I mentioned, right? We start with examples and then we iteratively update. It sort of tells us how to update. And then we find some optimizer that, which is it's a function of there's an M missing. So it's some function that tells us how do we compute some gradient, how do we, given some gradients, compute a new value. And right, so to tell you what I'll be doing, I want to first tell you the rough structure of this problem, sort of all the sorts of things people have done, and there's like so many different things. So they all interact in a relatively complex way, and there's so many ways the information flows backwards and forwards. And sort of the rough picture, if you try to look at any tutorials online, I think all of them are going to have a variant of a picture like this, which is very ad hoc, and lots of things are left to your imagination and sort of are often inconsistent. So this is the story, right? You start with some input. Let's say I always use this example of an image of a cat, which you put into a big neural network. Now, what is a neural network, right? It's a sequence of interconnected layers where it has, in this case, 4 inputs. But for us, we would encode the image of a cat as a big point in some high-dimensional space. So this might have like thousands and thousands of inputs, where each one of them is like 1 pixel. And then what happens is that the computation is propagated in layers. So this is the input, and this is sort of what's called the hidden layer, meaning that the output here is determined by these weights, which are changing, which will change as we learn and update them. But we start with some initial guess at these weights, initialize them randomly, I suppose, and compute the hidden layer, and then keep computing. And this could be hundreds of layers. I've looked it up. ChatGPT, the current iteration, is estimated to have 1.7 trillion parameters. So that's just to give you a sense of how big this thing is these days. It started with hundreds and millions and billions, now it's really a lot. But at some point, we get some prediction that we compare with our label, because we know this is a cat, and we say, hey, this is how we wanted, you were wrong. We phase it or something. And we use this signal. So now that we know how wrong it was, we can estimate, well, sort of counterfactually, well, what in the local vicinity, as the local linear approximation next to your possible guesses that we could have had, what would be a better guess, right? What is the valuation of all of these possible guesses? And then since we know that, we can say, well, what should our input be to be a little bit more correct? And then once we know what our output should. And once we know that, we can say, well, how much should we have changed our hidden layer so that it will be closer to what we want to be here, and so on. And this is something that's called backward, right? Once we compute all these possible changes, then we use this optimizer that gives you a new parameter. Right, so I've spent a long time here, but I want to say there's a lot of moving bits and pieces. And when I tried to learn this, there was no formal diagram explaining what all of these mean. And there's lots of inconsistent notation. People say this is what back propagation really is. And I really wanted to just write some nice code. And then in addition, right, when you want to do this, you iterate this for some number of times, and stopping condition is sort of when you feel like it. Order in which you present the data is also chosen ad hoc. Sometimes you have some schemes, but it's pretty much random. You often batch data together because it's faster on your computer. And people have added also, I'm going to talk about architectures, but all sorts of normalizations and weird tweaks that make the system go faster. And it turns out once you actually want to implement this in practice, the efficiency concerns become very important. Namely, if you have 1.7 trillion parameters, you really want to make sure you're not duplicating any information. So some people say backprop is just a chain rule, and there's a lot of, notationally that is true, but a lot of efficiency concerns arise when you want to do something with it in practice. And right, so to keep giving you a sense of how I see the field and what's been happening, because there's so much stuff, right? It's all of the systems are doing it. People have spent the last 30 years, really, the main problem was designing the structure of the forward pass. So when it started all in the 70s or whenever people had a big fully connected neural network, everything was connected to everything, that put a lot of data in it. And then it might get a good result from the data, but people often realize, well, if we know something about the data we are putting in, we can use that to inform the structure. We can use that to inform the structure of our neural network. So for the last 30 years, the study of neural network architecture has become a very big and important field. So there's all these various names once you try to learn these things. Generative adversarial autoencoder, graph neural network, recurrent neural network, recursive neural network, topological neural network. I can probably, there's like tons more, I can't remember them now. So it was all confusing, and it was all confusing for me trying to learn this. And right, the theory is completely brittle. All the progress in structuring neural networks has been largely, I would call it, disjoint from the progress of in theory of that we now know of structuring programs that comes from type theory, functional programming, and category theory. And the construction of these things is really guided by heuristics and by ad hoc practices. We tend to understand individual models relatively well, but when we compose them, it is really poorly understood. So your inputs here don't have to be lists or vector. People are making all sorts of data structured inputs from trees, graphs, simplicial complexes I've learned, manifolds, all sorts of different structures that we have some mathematical formalism for is not being yet quite thoroughly substantiated in these architectures. And the lack of a foundation, so I really like one comparison from a New York talk about 7 years ago, which compared deep learning to alchemy. So it says, so first of all, it says, despite the mythical reputations, alchemy worked. When people were tinkering with all of the chemical interactions without a solid foundation of what's going down underneath, they made progress in creating better lab equipment. They found some new elements. They systematized some knowledge, and they did a lot of stuff. But they were quite preoccupied with, and it's not in general true, but many people were preoccupied in finding the elixir of life, the best compound that will solve all your problems and make you healthy. And today there's a lot of analogy between deep learning where we don't really have any idea what's going on. We're tinkering a lot, and we're hoping to get to the artificial general intelligence and wider. And somehow we seem to be making progress, which is very, at least a little bit concerning. Right, so this is how I understood the whole field. And my goal maybe is to give you a sense of what I've done together with many people here, but also elsewhere in trying to put big parts of this story on a nice foundation. So right, so there's all these different ways of thinking about this, implementing this, all these different structures. But how do we think about this? So what I claim is the result of my thesis, and again, many other people have done various bits of all this stuff, is a mathematical foundation for all of these things that encompasses both operational aspects, but artificial neural networks, loss maps, supervised learning, the way these things compose, optimizers, and does it in a way where you can change some of the underlying structures. So you can think about learning on some other spaces than Euclidean ones, but not all of them. It's not quite clear how to put all of these things together. And it's really uniform. There's no ad hoc choices. And I feel like I finally started to understand what's going on. So I hopefully I can tell you something about this. So basically, we've turned the result of my PhD was turning this into this picture. It's taken 4. Sorry?
No, the cat's still there.
It's nice, right? We've abstracted away the cat. Yeah. Oh, there's more cats than I would want. So I basically have a few slides, and I'm not going to make it very technical, but in the previous picture, it wasn't clear what happens when what is backpropagated, what is the information flow, how do we think about it. And in this picture, I believe all the details have been sort of unglued together and separated out. So the rough idea through this picture is just like before, your data comes from the top. And then including here, we have including the parameter, in addition to the parameter, we have this S. which represents the state of the optimizer. And I forgot to mention, these optimizers have their own states, and people do all sorts of crazy things. But this is the input, and then you get a cat, a label, a parameter, and what you get out is a new parameter and a new state for your optimizer. And the computation unfolds here in a particular way. So model here corresponds to the artificial neural network. Loss function is loss, and optimizer is spelled with an S and here with a Z. But it's the same thing. So I'll sort of give a rough sense of how I'm thinking of this with the category structure and how this helps me understand this stuff. So first of all of the wires sort of have a forward and a backward passage, which encapsulates this idea that when you do this learning, everything we're doing, there's sort of some sort of a feedback or an update. At some point, we might delete some wire, but that's our choice. And in principle, that doesn't have to be true. That doesn't have to happen always. So the way you think about this, right, is the same story as before, and I'm now wondering whether to stay on this or go on. Right, and I will go into this much more later, but it is separated out. There's forward and backward pass, but it's also conceptually separated out the weights or parameters. And a lot of things came out of this. So I will just skip to the part where I talk about maybe the more important thing, which is the anatomy of a neural network. And please feel free to interrupt if something is unclear so far. So in order to understand that picture, I think it's a good idea to spend time on looking at what do I really mean when I say a model? Because when I learned this, I feel like it helps me clear up a lot of misconceptions I had about what happens in neural networks and how these things go. So this is the model in that picture. And the way I think about it is think about category theory morphisms and objects. These things on the boundaries are the object. These are the external ports to which other models or loss functions can connect to. But in addition to this, there is a part of data which is hidden from the outside world, which is a private knowledge of private information of the neural network. These are the parameters. And what's happening is the following. So on the left side, we're going to get inputs for our neural network, and these might be predictions. Predictions or otherwise inputs to other layers. We have many groups. What we receive back is going to be a gradient or some sort of a feedback about what we have predicted. And here, so I should maybe add a qualification. This is the gradient of this prediction, and here we're going to have the same sort of gradient, but with respect to this input, you're going to say how this input, you're going to file back information towards the previous learner. And here we're going to have parameters, they're the inputs, and here we're going to have sort of gradient with respect to the parameters. So I should do gradient for the predictions. Right, so what happens here? We get an input. So there is one important thing here, which is, so I spent a lot of time trying to think about how to do an exposition of these things. And I feel like for many people who I've talked to, it's often obvious, but I often find that when I explain this to somebody who's seen this for the first time, there's a lot of questions that go unanswered, and I'm trying to be aware of this. So maybe I'm taking this too slow for some people, too fast for others. But this picture has so many wires, and it's like, what order do things come in? What happens first, right? And I think it might be useful to point this out, because it clears up a lot of misconceptions about the other picture that was here. Well, it wasn't clear in which order things happen, what goes first, how do you actually do it. So what happens is you get an input, and you get a parameter. In principle, these things, you can think of them as happening at the same time, but there's good reason to think of as inputs coming first and then parameter second. You make a prediction about what you've done, and then you receive some feedback and then you produce two things out. You produce feedback with respect to the input you've gotten and the gradient with respect to the parameter. And now it might not be clear how to put numbers here, but I'm going to put 5 and 6 here. So again, I might not be saying very crazy things, but I feel like it's a useful abstraction. So why am I taking so much time in thinking about all these things at this level? Because, right, remember, all of these things, this could be a list, this could be a simplicial complex, this could be all sorts of different things, which we have to provide an abstract interface for plugging together. And I claim this is a good interface for doing so. Because if you have other things on the side, you can compose them as we see there. And if you have things on the left side, you can compose them. We're going to see that all sorts of layers in all neural networks are of this form. And you can think of ChatGPT as having a very roughly, it is exactly an example of this, except there's lots more details. But it's inside of this.
It's noticeable that time very nearly goes clockwise, which is good sense for time to happen. And it's only because the board is ethically two-dimensional that you have to put the parameter, the thing that you're communicating the parameters about on the top, rather than in front of us or behind us. If the arrow from the parameter came from behind the board into the top left of the diagram, it could go out to behind the board from the bottom right.
Yeah.
And then time really would go clockwise.
Yeah. And on the backwards pass, it goes counterclockwise. Right.
So you mentioned ChatGPT. What will the parameters be in that instance? Because the input is whatever you type in.
Right. So ChatGPT comes. So the thing you see for ChatGPT, you don't have. So it's been trained, and what you see is just the inference stage. So ChatGPT, now take your parameters and think of them as being. We're going to need one more dimension. ChatGPT is going to be something like this, where your parameters are going to come in. Now I'm going to put the inputs on the bottom, but you're going to have many possible inputs. So you're going to have sort of a sequence of tokens that you put in, and your parameters are going to be perhaps many, but usually they're just the same ones, and you're going to have many outputs. So during training, ChatGPT is trained in a particular way where you will put some feedback back here, but when you interact with it online, you sort of forget about the parameters they've been trained. And what's happening is that you input tokens here, like hello, I am. And once you stop inputting, it sort of starts predicting the next stuff. There's a lot of details, but that's the rough idea. So this is one of these things, because the inputs here for ChatGPT, you can think of them as lists, vectors or whatever. And you're going to have lists here again. And the way this list of outputs depend on this one is sort of nuanced, where the first element depends only the first one, but the second one is going to depend on all of the context before. So one thing that might become apparent in this picture is that there's lots of moving parts, and we can use this and we can talk about this and make interesting observations. But what is actually going inside of here? What is the structure of this neural network? So there's three choices you have to make. So the first one is you need to make a choice of sort of the forward pass, which means you have to make a choice of what comes into the input. How do we, given a parameter, an input, produce an output, right? This is the usual thing we learn. Trying to find the best parameter such that this input produces a good output. And you might think that's it, but I'm going to add something here later. And then you might say, well, okay, depending, given the output, I will have to produce a change with respect to the parameter and a change with respect to the original input. But the important thing is that the change I produce will depend on what the original input is. So we have this extra wire between. And so the choice involves basically choosing the type of this wire. And there's things to be said about whether we're operational or rotational, and the forward pass and the backward pass. And I have to say really that when I say the forward pass, I'm thinking about right, given a parameter in a list, I also leave some information what is going to be used for the backward pass, and this is what we call crucial. So when I write the forward pass here, often people just think of it like this, where you have this, and then you sort of just copy this information here. And that is one way of doing it, but there's many other ways as well. So yeah, you can model this, and that's what we've done in our paper and in sort of in general kinds of learning. You can model all kinds of layers like this. You can model loss functions like this. There's these things that are just called reparameterization that can allow you to model optimizers, and yeah, I think that's it's. So now the question is, right, I want to come back to the original point. It's a very complex field. There's all sorts of things people are today doing, and I want to remark on how many of these things can we do today. And to do so, I will draw attention to that something that might help us understand this a little bit better, which is that this thing is sort of composed of two different semantic concepts. One is the bidirectional flow of information, and the other one is the fact that this information is parametric. So that's what I'm going to do. And why I'm doing this is because there is something that's still bugging me about this. There's still something that's bugging me about this, and it's not quite solved. So this is the story. If you talk about general process theory or just morphisms in a category, or let's say a monoidal category, we think of them like this. These are the boundaries, and this is the underlying implementation. But there are two ways in which this is sort of an insufficient or not a well-detailed model of neural networks. First of all, these processes in our story aren't just processes, but they depend on some choice of a parameter p. So it is not the case that I just have x to y, but I have this secret information. And you might say, well, Bruno, why didn't you draw this like this? This might be fine. This might look like a map of type p times x to y, but the important bit of information is that the choice of parameter is the data of homomorphism. There might be different. I want to talk about all maps from x to y, which includes the choice of p. So I drew it from the top because it signifies this distinction. But again, that's not the story of neural networks, because the story is also about parameterization. About bidirectionality, which is our morphisms really. Because I'm thinking about implementing this. I want to eventually have some programming tool where this is actually encoded, and just modeling it as a morphism doesn't give me all the details of all the stuff that's going on. And the second part is that we have a forward and backward mode of interaction. So, our objects aren't just objects, but there's, I will call them pairs for now. Pairs of objects where the forward part happens first, and then some information saved in the backward part happens. And this explains why the neural network is as it is, because it arises out of the composition of these two. So notice that you have a parametric bidirectional map, which means that your parameters now also are bidirectional. So you make a choice of not just P, but P and P prime, because that's what their options are. You get something in this shape. Right, so I'm going to get somewhere where I want to, which is the following. Yeah, so I can talk a lot about the actual categorical structure here. I can talk about all the ways we've done, but there is something that I think is still quite a little bit unsatisfactory in our story. And it's this bidirectional story. If you've heard us mention the word dependent optics, it's sort of this. Because I think it's important. So there's a few reasons. Right, so there was a reason why I didn't label the wires in the previous diagram. I labeled them inputs, outputs, and observations and parameters, but there was a reason I didn't label them with sort of more formal mathematical notation, because it appears that there are currently two distinct modeling choices when it comes to modeling these bidirectional things. And I'd love to, like, you know, if somebody disagrees with this or thinks this is wrong, I'd love to understand why, but I haven't heard the good reason. So we can, you know, so we can either do the following. We can model this with simple types and say, well, if you have a let's be set a set here, and two sets here, and then some mediating object. And with simple types, we can model all sorts of learning, and that's what I've done in my thesis. I've chosen this particular modeling tool, and because it allows us to track this residual information coherently. And this is where I talk about operationally aware aspect of this. When you want to actually implement backward practice, you want to make sure you memorize a lot of information that you have. And when you do it this way, you can. When you compose this shape of co-optics, you get a lot of useful stuff. So when I compose two of these, my internal space is the n is going to be the product of these. So I sort of save more things in memory than more things they compose. But you know, there's also the lens choice where I can do this. Where I can compose it like this, and then composition becomes a little bit more non-trivial. So this is still simple types, it's just lenses, but when we compose them, there's a lot of funny business going on in the backward pass. You have to do simplification, and you have to we do a lot of recomputation, which is problematic if we have 1.7 trillion parameters. So I want to think about how to have our theory not be just descriptive, but prescriptive of this methods. And I've chosen this particular trade-off where I just do simple types. Now, what's the problem? If you want to differentiate through lists or through all of these manifolds or through all of the interesting stuff, if you want to have branching, people do all sorts of stuff today. You can't really go with simple types, and that's a problem. So this is one modeling choice to say no. There's the other one, which is modeling this with dependent types. And categorical models that use differentiation, the categorical models of differentiation that account for dependent types. There is at least a few, and maybe the one that I know the most of is tangent categories, which is a nice model, but the way I understand it, and again, I'd love to talk about this more, is that the way it models learning, and if I model it prescriptively as it tells me, I will do an implementation that only does this very, I would call it unoptimized code. And then if I want to actually use it in a big system, I will have to do some tricks outside of my theory to make it work nice. So in my view, there's two ways of modeling backdrop here that don't have a clear answer. And so these would be optics. This would be lenses. And and we can model things with dependent lenses, which I didn't really describe, which we here, but it's not clear how to do both of these. And depending on who you ask, you might get different answers on whether this makes sense or not, and different people have different ideas about what are dependent optics. There's one I have that I haven't found an answer to. So it's something I want to sort of say, which is left open from my work, the work of many people here. That it's not quite satisfactory. We can't quite go all the way. Thinking about where to go next. Was this clear so far? Was there anything? I think I'm basically towards the end is what I mean. And I feel like I haven't sort of told you what we've done. But basically, this is the result. We have now, I think, a model of backdrop that clears a lot of things up conceptually. That is implementation aware, but not dependent lenses implementation aware. We can't sort of do all the things we want. But we've cleared up a lot of structure of what was going on here.
Bruno,
Yeah, oh yeah.
I have a question about, so this picture of lenses and optics, it doesn't seem to have the parameter part that you have on the left bit.
I'm just looking at them without parameters now.
Is there any difference with the parameters?
So yes, I mean, if you have parameters.
I guess the question is, do you not put them because it's too complicated or because it doesn't change anything?
Oh, I'm saying is that if you solve it without parameters, it should be straightforward. You just transfer it.
So can you draw again a picture with the parameter in it, please? Because that's sort of a question maybe to that.
Yeah.
Right, because what this, so there's an asymmetry here, which I'm interested in maybe missing it because it looks to me like what's happening is that there is a coparameter. So there's one wire going down in the back, one wire coming to the front, and there's a piece of that wire.
So yes, absolutely. So what you can do is actually model this as sort of, and this is yeah.
Yeah, so does this give you something extra or?
What do you mean? I mean, it's the same picture, just topologically.
Yeah, okay, sure, but now you can erase it at the bottom, the loop at the bottom, and replace it with some other object.
Right. So this is the thing with optics, right? Is that yeah. So you can sort of model them. You know, you can have something like this here, like a co-state. So yeah, I would answer the question of whether it gives you something new is depending on whether you're wanting to model things denotationally. Do you just care about given this input, this is our output I get, this is how I see the thing from outside. Because when you look at this from the port outside, you cannot detect that this is here.
Yeah, sure, but you're also really interested in the
Yeah. So this is one thing we're trying to model, and then it becomes problematic when you want to add dependence. So if you want to have the backward type depend on the forward, it becomes quite unclear what depends on what and what should depend on. Because the job, so in the formulation of a dependent lens in the backward pass, when you write something like this, the small a, right? So this says for each a given, this is the standard form, so I'm not going to need to explain too much, but this A serves sort of a dual purpose. It's used to determine the type of the output path, but it's also used to inform the value. And what we do what we do in optics is sort of factor this out through this M, and then it becomes unclear how to do that. It takes a while to unpack. Yeah.
So we have an online question. Does this bring anything quantitative to the fine-tuning versus transfer learning versus scratch pre-training versus alternatives debates? And then related to the design of good metrics, for instance?
Yeah, I would say not yet. We are still, the way I see upfield of applied category theory is that you first take the knowledge, you first try to model things people already know about. So all of this stuff, everybody knows, quote unquote, this is not surprising, there's nothing new here. And we're still stuck at just giving a sound model of what's happening. And I think going the other way, informing some new things will come, and it's sort of coming from different areas, but for these particular things, I don't know if anything has been informed yet. But yeah, I think I'm practically towards the end, and I want to finish by saying there's a lot of things done, and the foundations, in my mind, are quite close to being a useful tool to actually start building things with this. But it's not quite there yet, and there's a few little thorns in the theory that always seem to mess things up, and I'd love to understand them. There's a lot of, once this is a little bit more clear, I feel like a lot of things that are now happening in deep learning could be understood, explained, and we can provide a tool so that you actually understand what's going on. You don't have to think about ad hoc ways of constructing architectures. You can sort of use some more formal tools, and hopefully we can transport some stuff from, say, type theory and category theory into this. People are now doing all sorts of algorithmic things. There's the neural algorithmic reasoning field of deep learning, where the structures in these neural networks are very complicated, not just with ifs and branches, but a lot of sort of dynamic programming stuff is happening inside of them. And we have a lot of interesting tools, from categorical semantics, initial algebra, and all of these things. And I'd love to try to use them. I think we're at the point where we can't do that quite yet, and it's a little bit dissatisfying. I think I'll just end this here. So
there's a related follow-up question. Can you say something about the compositionality of agents, given that no one knows how to do it?
So what turned out is that this model of neural networks started to have a lot of similarities with models of economic agents in game theory, from Jules and everyone here. And there were recent interesting advances where, which is actually something I forgot to mention, is I didn't quite give you the full story of what happens on types here in the forward and backward path. And understanding this is a good way to actually understand what happens in relation to agents. Because when I say I have an X and a Y here, and let's imagine I have some tangent space, this is X in X, this is Y in Y, and I'm going to have some tangent space Y at a point Y. You might think, well, I'm propagating back a tangent vector. You could think that, and that's true, if you're assuming, so this is a vector space, and this is true under some assumptions on your vector space, but I would call a more refined way to think about this that you're not propagating back vectors, you're propagating back covectors, something that evaluates water. So you make a distinction between the input, the space of possible changes, and the evaluations of that space, and that's what you propagate back. And the reason why you can think of this like this is because you are assuming some sort of inner product here, so you can go back and forth. But you often can't assume an inner product, and this is also linear, right? But in cases where you can't, if you have some sort of, let's call it payoff space, and you have a map to R instead, then you can't go back if this is just any map. With this formulation, you can, by propagating sort of valuations on your payoff space, this becomes exactly the model of economic agents in game theory. So this gives you a compositional way to model all of these things. Yeah.
Does this say anything about attention?
Right, that's a particular architecture, and I'd love to understand it. It's one of these things inside here that's constructed in a very particular way. The main trick is that you know you're going to have something that's sort of copied, you have processing, and then it goes something like, you know, you can think of it as being the input to your parameter, but it's part of the same layer. And you sort of learn from your inputs to attend sort of, it's a weird thing that I don't quite understand yet. Yeah.